Thank you. The next item of business is a debate on motion 15529 in the name of Neil Gray on impact of national insurance increase on public services. I would invite those members who would wish to participate in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Cabinet Secretary Neil Gray to speak to and to move the motion. Up to 11 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I move the motion in my name. During the recent UK general election, we highlighted the real and pressing challenges in UK public finances. During the campaign, these were largely dismissed by the Labour Party. During the campaign, Rachel Reeves said, and I quote, "I'm under no illusions about the scale of the challenge we face. We don't need higher taxes." While I have a degree of sympathy for the challenges the Chancellor inherited, Labour has not chosen to meet that challenge by looking to those with the broadest shoulders, as we called for. Instead, Labour has delivered a hike to employers' national insurance contributions. It would appear, without first considering the impact that it would have. Rather than a progressive approach, Labour has chosen a regressive tax on employment. This was a trend on not realising the consequence first seen in July with the winter fuel payments, where, without any consultation with the Scottish Government, Labour decided to cut the funding for this vital benefit to Scottish pensioners. Crucially, the Chancellor has not committed to fully reimburse the costs of the increase to those providing public services. These are costs that will be very challenging for the Scottish Government to bear. We expect the uplift next year to the Scottish Government's overall resource funding position to be only around 1% in real terms before national insurance contributions consequentials. In short, Presiding Officer, if the UK Government does not fully reimburse these costs, there will be a significant detrimental impact on the delivery of public services. I give way to Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. Does he recognise that it's not just an increase in the percentage of employers' national insurance, but also a decrease in the annual earnings threshold, which will sweep far more workers into that category and increase the bill to employers, and in particular in care home providers, where we've seen a mass exodus from the market in the Highlands already? That's only going to accelerate the problem.
Cabinet Secretary.
I agree with Alex Cole-Hamilton about the impact that the changes are going to have. I was hearing that this morning at Leith Surgery, where the exact point that he was referencing about lower paid workers being brought in, having a disproportionate impact on those that employ lower paid workers, is absolutely right, which is why I hope we can count on Liberal Democrat support for our motion at decision time. The decision to increase employer national insurance contributions will increase the direct costs faced by the Scottish public sector by well in excess of £500 million in 25-26, costs that could not be foreseen prior to the budget just a few weeks ago. And in the days that followed the announcement, it was evident that neither the Chancellor nor her colleagues seemed to understand the impact of this decision. In the days that followed, the Chancellor would say one thing, but the Chief Secretary to the Treasury would say another. The costs had been reimbursed. The costs had not yet been reimbursed. The Chief Secretary at one point claimed that many primary and social care providers would benefit from the more generous employment allowance introduced by the budget, but the employment allowance is not available to any contractor that does more than half of their work in the public sector. And so now, just 2 weeks before our own budget, we still do not know how much funding we will receive. In fact, we won't get formal confirmation until after the coming budget process has been concluded, perhaps as late as May. So today, the Scottish Government has published its estimates of the direct costs to the Scottish public sector from this change, looking across our health and social care services, education providers, the third sector and others. We have shared these costs with the Treasury and have asked them for urgent clarification on the level of compensation that Scotland will receive. If the Chancellor does not, I will do in a second, if the Chancellor does not fund this in full and instead relies on the Barnett formula, it could be that with costs of over £500 million, at best £380 million would be forthcoming. Depending on what is reimbursed, this could be a cost to services of around £140 million to £200 million, and if it is less than a £380 million reimbursement, this will put the Scottish budget into an extremely difficult position. I give way to Murdo Fraser.
I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for giving way, and I don't disagree with many of the points he's made already, but there is something missing from his speech and something missing from his motion today, and that's any reference to the impact on the private sector, who of course provide the earnings and the taxes that support public services. So in terms of the work the Scottish Government are doing, have they done any analysis of the impact on Scotland's private sector from this national insurance increase?
Cabinet Secretary.
I appreciate the point that Murdo Fraser makes, because I think this is regressive to growth. UK government's supposed #1 priority is growth, and their own figures from the OBR demonstrate that this is going to have a negative impact on growth. And I will come to some of the elements in the private sector that have a contractual relationship with public services in my speech, and Ivan McKee will touch on greater depth the impact on the wider economy that I think Murdo Fraser is right to point out. It means that Scotland's public services would pay the cost of the UK government's tax increase. It means that what the UK government budget gives to Scotland on one hand, the Chancellor is taking away with the other. And as you know, NHS Scotland is our largest employer, presiding officer, with over 180,000 staff working day in and day out to protect the nation's well-being. My officials have estimated that the total direct cost to the NHS alone in 2025-26 will be almost £200 million as a result of this change. We also estimate that at this stage there is a further £40 million cost impact on independent contractors providing vital services such as GPs, dentists, pharmacists and optometrists. That is not included in the £500 million figure and is of acute concern to me, and that is because the Chancellor has decided not to include any funding for independent contractors. That's not a penny for GP practices that our communities rely upon. Dr Ian Morrison, chair of the Scottish General Practice Committee, recently told the Scotsman that, and I quote, "These additional costs could therefore threaten the viability of practices and lead to cutbacks in services, which ultimately means that it is patients who will suffer." I've also heard directly from Dr Morrison, who will be meeting later, on his concerns from the National Insurance uplift, as well as from professionals representing NHS dentists, ophthalmologists and pharmaceutical sectors, and I am grateful for all of their submissions. All are clear that failing to mitigate the cost pressures felt by contractors risks jobs and NHS service delivery now, and jeopardises our ongoing reform and ambition to move to a preventative and community-based model of care in Scotland. Do I have time in hand? I do. Mr Hoy.
I thank the Minister for giving way, but will he concede that the cost pressures that were faced by GPs and dentists were already in place as a result of decisions taken by his government? And this is the cumulative impact that is now effectively the straw that could break the camel's back.
Cabinet Secretary.
No, the uplift that we've given to GP services, I recognise, is still challenging, but it aligns with the DDRB recommendations. I'm of course looking at what more I can do as I look to shift the resource and balance of care from secondary care services into primary and community care services, and I'll continue to engage with the BMA, with Dr Morrison and others on that point. But this strikes at the heart of our GP practices being able to employ an additional receptionist to cope with the additional lists in some areas, or indeed an additional advanced nurse practitioner, the staff that can help deliver the services we need them to do in communities, and that is why this has been such a regressive step. Having to wait until May 2025 for confirmation is too late for our independent contractors like GPs, as I was hearing at Leith Surgery this morning. They will have to make hiring decisions now without knowing how much those staff will ultimately cost. Many of these contractors are ineligible for the employment allowance, ironically, as a direct result of the work they provide for the NHS, and so will feel the full brunt of this change. And this is not just here in Scotland, this is across the UK. However, in Scotland, presiding officer, we recognise the importance of our independent contracting partners, even if Labour's budget fails to do so. So, presiding officer, while the impact on health and social care is profound, the changes to national insurance will impact all areas of the public sector in Scotland. COSLA estimate the impact on local government will be £265 million after accounting for the impact on teachers' pay. Our police service will face increased costs of over £25 million. Our prison service will face an additional £6 million bill. Our fire and rescue service will face further costs of over £5 million. Scotland's universities and colleges will see cost increases of £60 million. And for those helping our most vulnerable in our community, communities. The additional costs will bring significant anxiety over growing concern after years of cost pressures posed by the pandemic and the ensuing cost of living crisis. Social care services will be particularly penalised by the Chancellor's decisions, facing costs of over £84 million, a move which Donald McCaskill, all of us that were represented on Friday at their event, the Chief Executive of Scottish Care, has called the straw that breaks the camel's back. And the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations has estimated that the third sector, that vital network of charities, social enterprises, grassroots community groups that work to support our population well-being, will now have to send an additional £75 million to the UK Exchequer each year, which begs the question, Presiding Officer, why, when faced with a need to increase revenue, why did the Chancellor not ask those with the broadest shoulders to contribute more? Why did she decide to balance the budget on the backs of charities, of care providers, of hospices and health services? So it is clear that whilst the financial impact to Scotland's public sector is extensive, again reaching over £500 million, the wider non-financial costs to the services and our economy may be far greater, something that Ivan McKee will come on to in his closing speech. And so to conclude, Presiding Officer, these challenges were avoidable. The Scottish Government will do everything it can to protect its public services and the voluntary sector, but we cannot do this without the means. Had the UK Government chosen to discuss the possibility of raising employer national insurance contributions with the devolved governments, we could have helped them understand the challenges for Scotland. We are now, unfortunately, past that point. And that is where the folly of Labour's position in its amendment today is absolutely stark. The cost of this to directly funded public sector staff is more than £500 million. It is even greater when we consider the UK Government is refusing to protect GPs, social care providers and others. The ridiculous, the unsustainable folly that comes from Labour's position in Scotland that is arrived at is that the 1% real terms increase to our block grant is to pay for it, and that where the costs outweigh the available funds. So it all boils down to, once again, Scottish Labour asking Scottish public services to pay for a bad UK decision. What a shameful position they have got themselves into, where they will sell out our Scottish public services to fill the UK Treasury coffers. This Government will not stand for it, and I ask the Parliament to support our motion to ensure we send a message. We won't stand for this sellout of our public services.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I now call on Craig Coy to speak to and to move Amendment 15529.2. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. In politics, there are lies, damned lies, and then there are the election commitments and employment claims from Labour's new Chancellor of the Exchequer. While Rachel Reeves may or may not be an economist, it is now crystal clear that she is supremely capable of being economical with the truth. And it is clearer by the day that people, businesses and our public services will pay the ultimate price. And when it comes to national insurance, let's be clear about what the Labour Party's manifesto said. And I quote, "Labour will not increase taxes on working people, which is why we will not increase national insurance. Which is why we will not increase national insurance." Now, in recent weeks, Labour has argued that its commitment applied only to working people, but not employers. But Rachel Reeves' broken promise budget. I will take an intervention, and perhaps she can say what. Perhaps Jackie Bailey can say.
I find it quite extraordinary, Presiding Officer,
Jackie Bailey,
that 14 years of the Tories has just been wiped out at a stroke. What happened to Boris Johnson and Liz Truss that crashed the economy, that placed us into the position we are now in? Have some self-awareness.
Craig Coy.
Jackie Bailey is forgetting that inflation was falling, interest rates were falling, and economic growth was on an upward path, something that OBR now says is at threat as a result of the Labour Party's budget. Now, of course, the devil is, as always, in the detail of any Chancellor statement, and we should be alert to that. That is priced into politics. But this budget isn't priced in because few, if any, Chancellors have sought to raise tax by such a staggering amount in a single budget, £40 billion, and no Chancellor has sought to do it in such an underhand way. Deputy Presiding Officer, for the record, Labour's manifesto did not explicitly state that the commitment applied only to employee national insurance. I accept that. but we know it was deliberately opaque. And this point was reinforced by the IFS's Director Paul Johnson, who has stated publicly that increasing employer national insurance contributions is, and I quote, a straightforward breach of a manifesto commitment. Now, even if we did give the Labour Party the benefit of the doubt, and I think this is something that even the Labour members on these benches will struggle to do today, it remains clear that a rise in employers' contributions still amounts to a tax on working people, and now a tax on public service delivery. The Office for Budget Responsibility forecasts that approximately 3/4 of employee national insurance contributions will be passed on to employees, including those who effectively now deliver Scotland's public services. And Scotland's public sector will be unduly hit hard because it is larger and public sector workers are paid more than in the rest of the UK. And we will hear today that this is a £25 billion tax on jobs, and it will hit many organisations, directly and indirectly, who deliver our public services, and could cost councils alone £265 million. It will hit our GP surgeries, our universities, our care homes, the palliative care sector, independent nurseries, and a huge range of third sector organisations and private contractors who now face severe financial pressures. In short, this decision will cost jobs and result in lower real terms wages, thereby reducing the overall amount that will be raised by this measure after its indirect consequences are accounted for. And the OBR itself says that passing on employers' national insurance contributions increases will contribute to a sharp slowdown in real household disposable income growth in 2026 and 2027, the growth that this budget said it would deliver for Scotland. To put it in other words, this will undermine growth here in Scotland and right across the UK. And it is no surprise, therefore, that alarm bells are ringing across the public sector and in the many organisations delivering services on behalf of the state. And those concerned about the negative impacts of all of this come from a variety of well-respected groups here in Scotland, all who are now issuing similar stark warnings. The chairman of the BMA's Scottish GP Committee, Dr Ian Morrison, said, "We call on both the Scottish and the UK governments to urgently provide reassurances on additional funding and ensure that GPs will not be forced to shoulder the burden of these extra employment costs at the expense of the care that they will be able to provide to patients." Now, it's increasingly clear that it's not just GPs, it's the third sector and charities too. Marie Curie warns that Scotland's hospice sector began this year with a predicted £15 million budget deficit before NHS pay awards were taken into account. And it says that without urgent support now, further service cuts and turning away vulnerable patients will become unavoidable. And they say that ministers must act now, including Scottish ministers. And I quote, they say, "With the additional funding from the UK Government, the Scottish Government now has the opportunity and the financial means to demonstrate its commitment to supporting essential palliative care services." And I do give way to
Cabinet Secretary.
Given what I recognise the challenges that Craig Hoy is depositing to the Chamber today, but does he accept that, given what we have set out, that the uplift, the resource block grant uplift being less than 1% amounts to a very narrow window of opportunity to provide investment? And would it not be better that these issues are tackled at source and that we make sure that the proposals are properly mitigated by the UK Government, rather than the Scottish Government having to mitigate a bad UK decision once again?
Craig Hoy.
I do accept that in terms of the consequences of the national insurance increase, but perhaps the Scottish Government would have had more cash to play with at this point had it not agreed those inflation-busting public sector pay increases, which weren't in its budget last year and which led to the black hole that additional £1.5 billion that has been forthcoming is now being used to fill. But it isn't just health-related organisations that have expressed concern. The Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations warns that the scale of additional costs put the sector's essential services, jobs and organisations at risk. Peter Matheson of Edinburgh University, which has already announced the potential for job cuts, is warning that the small increase to tuition fees for students generates income that will be way below the significant increase in staff costs resulting from the national insurance increase. And that's why organisations right across Scotland who are charged with delivering many of Scotland's public services are rightly concerned and are demanding that they are fully reimbursed for these additional employer national insurance costs. And can I make this appeal to Scottish ministers? As they consider their own budget, they must pass on every additional and single penny that they receive to cover national insurance payments from the UK Government. And that includes local government, where the Scottish Government has an appalling record of pocketing the cash and giving the Scottish local authorities the leftover. I will do so. If I can get
Dr Summerson.
I thank Craig Hoy for taking the intervention. I've heard this afternoon from Aberdeenshire Council that say that in terms of national insurance, they've got an extra £10.7 million of additional costs. In terms of the real living wage, an extra £1.5 million extra cost, and the health and social care partnership, an extra £6.3 million. So in terms of the Labour autumn budget, that's an extra £18.5 million that Aberdeenshire Council
Mr Lumsden, that's a very long intervention.
Does he agree with me
Mr.
that the
Hoy,
Scottish Government
I think you've got enough to respond to that. And in doing so, Mr Hoy, I would ask that you start to bring your remarks to a close. Thank you.
I thank Dr Lumsden for his very succinct intervention. I fully accept that there are cost pressures in councils right across Scotland, and that's where the Scottish Government cannot absolve itself for blame here either. They too have made poor financial decisions, wasting £2.7 billion of taxpayers' money this term alone, while shortchanging Scotland's council. The Scottish Government has failed to grow the Scottish economy, and they would have had an additional £600 million to spend this year alone had they done so. And now I think it's quite clear that together the Labour Party and the SNP...
But Mr Hoy, you will need to conclude, and please move your amendment. Thank you.
The very survival of public
Mr Hoy, please conclude and move your amendment.
Thank you. And I move the amendment.
Thank you very much. I now call on Jackie Bailey to speak to and to move Amendment 15529.3. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's not often that the SNP government have any debate to do with any aspect of health, as they normally want to run away from their own dismal record. But if there is an opportunity to blame someone else, they're first in the queue. What is puzzling, what is genuinely puzzling, is that the Scottish Government is still supposedly in discussion with the UK Government, and I hadn't heard that negotiations had ended. Perhaps more negotiation and less posturing would serve the people of Scotland much better. Let me turn to the substance of the motion. The Labour UK Government made a choice to make progress. The Labour UK Government made a choice in the budget to protect working people and invest in public services. They had to fix 14 years of mess that just because you're loud doesn't mean I'll give way. They had to fix 14 years of mess that they inherited from the last Tory government. And this is a budget that kept our promises to Scotland. It ended the era of austerity. It provides billions for investment in public services, and it prioritises economic growth. It is no secret, Presiding Officer, that public services in Scotland are in crisis after years and years of cuts and mismanagement by this SNP government. There has been repeated failure. There has been repeated failure to reform our school system as performance in international comparisons continues to decline. 1 in 6 Scots are on an NHS waiting list. I'll give way if you tell me how you're going to fix that.
The opportunity to fix that is, of course, made much harder by this decision on national insurance contributions. Now, the point that the amendment that comes from Labour today is asking us to use the less than 1% uplift to our resource budget to mitigate a bad UK government decision. Surely that is an unsustainable position for any party in the Scottish Parliament to be they have to defend Scottish public services.
I didn't hear a question in there, nor an explanation of why there are 1 in 6 Scots on NHS waiting lists. NHS workers are struggling to treat patients in a system that has not faced up to the reality of an ageing population with equipment that is frankly years out of date. Hospices have been asking the SNP for help for almost 2 years. Third sector care providers have been warning about the crisis in social care for years. And the Cabinet Secretary has done nothing, because instead of listening to them and making a difference, the SNP have prioritised division and managed decline. The Scottish Government have been given the largest increase in their budget in history, outside of the COVID years. It's now for them to decide how to deliver it to the frontline services that people depend on. There's an extra £789 million of funding for health and social care this year, an additional £1.72 billion for next year. Now, I understand the concerns of those in the health and care sector, but I also understand that Scotland will receive additional money to help the public sector manage changes to national insurance. Of course, it will be for the Scottish Government to decide how that money is dispersed. The SNP can now decide whether it will give extra funding to hospices, to GPs, to dentists, to care providers. That is, just listen for a minute, that is devolution, because the Scottish Government will get the money and can decide its priorities for allocation. Now, I know that Wes Streeting will be allocating funding to hospices shortly, taking account of the pressures on their services. Why can't Neil Gray do so now? The Cabinet Secretary could make a commitment now about how the money he receives will be spent. Perhaps he can tell the Chamber whether he intends to use it to cover employers' contributions for civil servants in St Andrew's House or Victoria Quay. Now, I'm sure the Chamber will want to be reminded that the civil service in Scotland has grown from 15,800 in 2007 to 26,900 in 2024. Will the Cabinet Secretary tell us now that any money for national insurance contributions will be spent on those who deliver services in our communities, in health and social care, rather than the army of civil servants?
Cabinet Secretary.
An appalling example of obfuscation from Jackie Bailey, where she is suggesting the nonsense that has been projected here. But the UK Government has said itself that they will not pass on support to GP contractors, to social care providers, to anybody operating with a public contract in the health service to support them. So the money that comes to us is not going to be expected to do the same. This is an appalling example of a defence of an appalling position from the UK Government, and surely Jackie Bailey has got to realise that the Chancellor has got to step in and ensure there's proper mitigation here for the Scottish public service.
Jackie Bailey.
I look forward to the debate, but that was frankly not an intervention. It was much longer than that, so I hope I'll get some time back. But let me say to you that there's £10 million in the list you've published, that is about Scottish Government employer national insurance contributions. You could use that to fund the hospice movement, to fund GPs, to do things differently. Now, the Scottish Government has already received significant resources, but who trusts them to spend it wisely? Because we've got 17 years of evidence that demonstrates that they are financially incompetent. I know that the people of Scotland will take a very dim view if the NHS and social care don't start to improve soon. The single biggest threat to Scotland's NHS and social care is the SNP's dangerous incompetence, and no amount of deflection and scaremongering can hide that. Of course, the Chancellor of the Exchequer is considering the impact of employer national insurance contributions before the changes come into force in April. As a result of the changes made, around half of all businesses who are liable for national insurance will pay the same or less than they were previously, and around 57,000 businesses in Scotland will pay nothing at all. And of course, two people on the SNP's benches, who I know will benefit, have set up companies to avoid paying tax and national insurance on their additional earnings. That hypocrisy is breathtaking. So the SNP must get on with the discussions with the UK Labour Government. They must listen to calls from stakeholders and use the money they have to ensure that the public service delivery is prioritised. While the SNP carp from the sidelines and mismanage Scotland's budgets, Labour is delivering record levels of funding for Scotland, supporting the NHS and cleaning up the mess the Tories left behind. Disappointingly, after 17 years, all that the SNP can do is posture and let Scotland down.
Thank you, Ms Bailey. I would remind all those members who are seeking to speak in the debate to ensure that they have pressed the request to speak button. And I now call on Ross Greer to open on... Ms Bailey, did you move your amendment?
Can I move the amendment in my name?
Thank you very much indeed. And I now call on Ross Greer to open on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I certainly wasn't going to be moving that amendment. And if this morning's polling didn't confirm it, that contribution from Jackie Bailey shows just how rattled the Labour Party in Scotland is. by the appalling decisions that their colleagues are taking in the UK government. I wanted to start on a positive, because the Greens do believe the UK government should increase spending, and I welcome the principle behind the budget that spending has increased. I recognise that we do need to invest. We do need to increase spending on public services to recover from 14 years of UK Conservative austerity. I don't agree with all the Labour government spending decisions on dead ends like carbon capture and storage, for example, but that's for another debate. But employer national insurance contributions had to be one of the worst places that they could have gone to raise additional revenue. That's been proven by the flood of emails into all of our inboxes from concerned employers, from workers, from parents. I'm going to come on to childcare in a moment. But as well as the decision itself, this has been an appalling process. How do the Labour Party, how do the UK Government expect the Scottish Government, local councils, charities, third sector organisations to be able to set competent budgets when nobody knows what their plan for mitigating this is? No one yet knows what the consequentials for the Scottish Government will be. Jackie Baillie repeatedly mentioned hospices there. Nobody yet knows what level of compensation hospices are going to receive. The stakeholders that I've spoken to have had indications from the Treasury that Scotland is just going to get a Barnett consequential share. What I didn't hear from Jackie Baillie at all was any recognition of the fact that because of the size of our public sector, that would be a huge shortfall in funding for Scotland. And I didn't believe that the Labour Party wanted a smaller state until I heard Jackie Baillie's opening contribution there, because now it sounds like she wants to see more civil servants losing their jobs. I'd be interested to hear her party leader clarify that when he's invited to speak to the STUC Congress in a few months' time. Yes, I'll give way to Mr.
I thank Mr Greer for giving way. And yes, we have heard Jackie Baillie saying today that she wants civil servants to lose their jobs. She talked about the growth in the civil service here, but what she hasn't talked about is the fact that the powers that we have are now greater, and we require more folk to deliver those public services for people.
Ross Greer.
I'm grateful to Mr Stewart for that intervention. The most obvious example of that expansion that he talks about is in Social Security Scotland, where payments like the game-changing Scottish Child Payment are lifting tens of thousands of children out of poverty. I'm proud that we have more civil servants in Scotland delivering measures like that. Now, COSLA have briefed us all, I'm sure, over the last few weeks on the impact this will have on them. They reckon the direct cost to councils will be £265 million, but the additional cost for the services that they contract out just in adult social care will be £85 million. That's before you get to children's social care, the early learning and childcare, third sector and private providers. The cost here is massive. But if you look at early learning and childcare, the cost for government is significant, but the cost for parents and carers is going to be significant as well, because providers will pass this on through increasing their fees. The Pregnant Then Screwed campaign have pointed out this is going to lead to mums in particular, parents, but mums in particular, leaving the workforce to care for their children, having a wider negative economic impact on the tax base, but on our economy as a whole, and on the businesses, of course, that they leave at a time of existing labour shortages. The Barnett share alone wouldn't take into account for example, council arm's length organisations, a different landscape in Scotland compared to England. The Cabinet Secretary mentioned the £40 million question mark for dentistry, optometry and pharmacy. The Labour Party haven't taken any of this into account, presiding officer. They haven't provided clarity to anyone. And I would ask Jackie Baillie, I would close on this point. Jackie Baillie and I both know the wonderful work done by the Children's Hospice Association Scotland at Robin House in Balloch. The hospice sector across the UK still don't know. The hospice sector in England do not yet know whether they will be partially or fully compensated by the UK Government. I would welcome Jackie Baillie clarifying on behalf of the Labour Party if the hospice sector and the palliative care sector in England are going to be fully compensated for this. Because if they are, I would argue for that to be directly passed on here in Scotland. But as yet, we have received absolutely no clarity, and those providing end-of-life care at the most difficult point in a family's life are unable to plan ahead for their next financial year. I think that is shocking, presiding officer. I cannot believe that we are here just a few weeks into what was supposed to be a progressive change of government at Westminster.
Thank you, Mr Greer. And I now call on Alex Cole-Hamilton to open on behalf of the Scottish Liberal Democrats. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak in this debate because there is a great deal of concern out there. So let me put this plainly from the start. The Chancellor Rachel Reeves' decision to increase employers' national insurance contributions without ensuring that, in particular, GPs, care home providers and charitable organisations like the hospice community, as we've just heard from Ross Greer, is a huge, that they're not compensated, is a huge mistake that risks stretching primary care and social care and the voluntary sector to breaking point. Even before these tax rises, GPs in my constituency have told me time and again just how up against it they are right now, and patients feel that too. There was a time, Presiding Officer, when you could see your GP at the first time of asking, but any of your constituents will tell you now that sometimes they have to phone dozens of times to get an appointment several weeks hence. These extra national insurance contributions will mean that many GP practices will be unable to follow through with recruitment plans that could have helped ease the pressure. I will take a brief intervention from Sandesh Gohani.
Sandesh Gohani.
Thank you for taking the intervention. Given the budget conversations that you're in, how will the Liberal Democrats fix this crisis in GP?
Always through the chair, Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Well, I'm very grateful for Sandesh Gohani's intervention. It won't surprise anyone watching this debate to know that Lib Dems, as we did in the general election campaign, have prioritised early access to primary care, and that means making sure that primary care has the resources it needs to see people fast. Presiding Officer, GPs are being punished by a flaw at the heart of the rules here. They're being treated as private contractors, but their work is entirely within the public sector. They're not entitled to employment allowance, which would have reduced their national insurance liability by up to £5,000 each year. The Institute of General Practice Management has estimated that this rise will mean the average of GP surgery's tax bill will go up by around £20,000 a year. That's equivalent to hundreds of appointments. I will take the Cabinet Secretary if I can have the time back, Presiding Officer.
Yes, briefly, Cabinet Secretary.
Yeah. I really appreciate Alex Cole-Hamilton giving way, because I think this is a really important point. I think we share an ambition to see more resource going into primary care. The Government's ability to do that, if there is not full mitigation of the cost of national insurance uplift to the entirety of the public sector, does he recognise that is put at risk, the ability for us to make further investments into primary care?
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
I think that the UK Government is not the sole arbiter of what the Scottish Government can put into primary care, but I do recognise it becomes all the harder if this mitigation is not put in place. And it's not just GPs that are stuck between a rock and a hard place here. Other care providers will be forced to make cutbacks too. Look at the challenge to pharmacies and hospices, as we heard very eloquently from Ross Greer there. Many dental practices too are struggling and might be forced to reduce their already limited NHS provision as a result of that. That would have serious consequences on already sparse patient access. Presiding Officer, we've seen dental deserts across our country emerging as a matter of course. Just today, my party uncovered that the UK Government has made no assessment of its tax hike on dentistry before making the change. And the BDA, the British Dental Association, say that that is reckless. Presiding Officer, we know also that Scotland's social care sector is in crisis. It too will be hit hard. In the Highlands, we've already seen a rash of closures across Highland care homes. This will only be accelerated by the increase in employers' NI, and I met with care providers today who are ashen-faced about the landscape they now face, and they point out, as I said in my intervention to the Cabinet Secretary, it's not just the increase in NI percentage itself, but also the decrease in threshold over earnings, drawing more part-time workers into that. Already thousands of people are left languishing in hospitals, sometimes for months, because of the lack of care home places or care packages in the community to receive them because they're too frail to go home. Not only is that unbearable for patients, but it causes a delay, an interruption in flow across our National Health Service. None of this has been helped by the SNP's decision to plough their time and money into the so-called National Care Service, which nobody now wants and which the Scottish Government should scrap immediately. And the last thing that the sector needs is for the UK Government to heap on more financial pressure through staffing costs. So Labour need to rethink this, because it's giving with the one hand to the NHS but taking away with the other. If they won't cancel their counterproductive tax on jobs, which this is, then exempt GPs and care providers so as not to make the health and social care crisis worse. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr Cole-Hamilton. We move to the open debate. I call first Kevin Stewart, to be followed by Liz Smith. Up to 4 minutes. Mr Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And let's be clear, we are in this mess because Labour tried to secure Tory votes, promising not to raise income tax, national insurance and VAT, despite knowing fine well about the multi-billion-pound black hole in the Westminster budget left by the Tories. They broke their promise by raising employers' national insurance. And they now claim the public sector will be protected from the tax hike, but they won't give a straight answer who is a public sector worker and who isn't. And they certainly can't give a straight answer as to whether the block grant to the Scottish Government will include compensation for the national insurance hike on public sector workers, or if Labour expects the Scottish Government to add the national insurance hike to the long list of Westminster's mistakes that Scotland has to mitigate. The Scottish budget will be published in 2 weeks, and the Finance Secretary doesn't have answers to basic questions from Labour. So we need to have some of those answers from Labour today. Will the block grant include additional compensation for the national insurance hike on public sector workers? Are GPs and their receptionists public sector workers, and will Labour reimburse them, or are they going to push their national insurance hike on hard-pressed GPs, knowing that the BMA says this will force GP practices to close? What about council workers? Will Labour reimburse the tax grab in them, or do they expect councils to sack teachers and scaffies to make up the difference? What about our colleges and universities? Already job losses have been announced. Others also face Labour's axe. Are they going to reimburse care workers? Because if they don't, the Coalition of Care and Support Providers in Scotland have made it clear that the effect on the social care sector will be catastrophic. And I want to quote Sue Freeth, who's the Chief Executive of the VSA in Aberdeen. She says there will be a catastrophic impact on Scotland's social care providers, including VSA. They look after 2,000 people across 25 services in Aberdeen and the north east of Scotland. The changes for VSA alone will impact on them up to £468,000. And I quote again from Sue Freeth, because she says that it is crucial that Westminster reverse this regressive policy for our sector, as this will cause Scotland to have an even greater crisis in public services. And if the care system in Scotland does have to bear these costs, if the care system here contracts or collapses because of Labour cuts, will the Labour Party pay for the hundreds of millions of extra NHS spending that will be required to treat frail and older people who end up in Scotland? These questions must be answered. And of course, one of the other hardest sectors will be childcare. And Mr Greer already mentioned Pregnant Then Screwed Scotland and their thoughts on all of this. But let's look at the quotes from parents. One parent says, "I would likely have to leave my job in the NHS." That is a double whammy. This has been a huge mistake by the Labour Party. We need answers on all of this. We need to see that cash from Rachel Reeves, or the public sector and public sector delivery in Scotland will suffer. It is clear that this has been a big mistake. Labour need to make sure that they resolve that error. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Liz Smith, to be followed by Stuart McMillan. Up to 4 minutes. Ms Smith.
Thank you. 50 prominent Scottish businessmen told the Prime Minister that the main threat to Britain's economic recovery was putting a tax on jobs, which of course is exactly what increasing employers' national insurance contributions actually is. That was back in 2010, when, if Jackie Baillie cares to remember, it was Gordon Brown and David Cameron who were fighting it out for the keys to number 10. and indeed when the late Alex Salmond supported the Scottish businesses' line of attack because he feared the worst for the effects on the Scottish economy. That tax on jobs, which is now in place thanks to the UK Labour government, means that employers will have to fork out £900 extra for each employer on median average earnings and £770 extra for those on a minimum wage. And a knowledge of just the most basic economics tells you what will happen. Costs will rise, jobs will be lost, and prices will rise for consumers. That knowledge will also tell you that it makes the hiring of staff and the creation of new jobs, most especially in the labour-intensive industries such as retail and hospitality, much more challenging, which in turn is likely to have a negative effect on economic growth, the very thing that we so desperately need. Where, for example, is the logic in a policy which our universities have said will cost them over £45 million on top of the very serious funding gap that Anton Muscatelli spoke at the weekend about when it comes to being the main driver of economic growth and innovation? Now, Labour's rationale for this is to plug what they say is a £22 million black hole, a statistic, incidentally, which we know is much disputed by economists. They want to ensure that there is much money available for public services, investment, most especially schools and NHS, and they told us too that there were other policies which would help business, so no one should get too worried. The trouble is that any potential benefits are immediately countered by several significant negative externalities. As the Chancellor was speaking, the UK's disability charities, who provide such vital services to some of the most vulnerable in our society, were telling the Prime Minister that the national insurers will mean life-changing cuts. We know too that Robert Kilgour of the Independent Care Homes Scotland Group said that it was a killer blow to the sector. In other words, public sector good and private sector bad all over again. And I know my colleague Sandesh Gulhani will expand on what it means for the medical profession. In other words, the concerns about this tax hike on employers' national insurance is proving to be an existential threat to many businesses. But I want to say something a bit more about this in the context of the Scottish economy and the current predictions from the Scottish Fiscal Commission. I would not be a Conservative if I did not believe in lower taxes and a smaller state, which I now see as a public sector that is 22% of the workforce. And I also believe in rewarding aspiration and supporting innovation and entrepreneurship. As a result, I strongly believe that we need to develop a much more effective working partnership between the public and private sectors, as we have in many other European nations. And on this matter, in relation to SNP economic theory, let me say this. They expand on the social contract, which from the First Minister's statements and other ministers' speeches is based, I think, on ensuring that the social infrastructure across the country is both coherent and generous when it comes to supporting our communities and our most vulnerable groups. That principle is all well and good, but it cannot be put into practice unless there is sufficient money to sustain the delivery and the quality of public services. And herein lies the dilemma for the SNP, because their big state, high-tax economy is not producing the revenues which Scotland so desperately needs to create. So it is little surprise that the combination of that problem, together with Labour's national insurance hike, that businesses are screaming from the rooftops. And, Deputy Presiding Officer, I don't blame them.
Thank you, Ms Smith. I now call Stuart McMillan to be followed by Carol Mochan. Up to 4 minutes. Mr McMillan.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. First of all, I'd like to remind the Chamber that I am the chair of Moving on Inverclyde, a local recovery service, a third sector organisation. We've already heard today that the uplift that's coming is less than 1%. We've also heard that Craig Hoy and the Conservatives criticised public sector workers getting wage rises, and also Jackie Baillie admitting that there has been 14 years of austerity affecting the economy. Now, that's actually really quite interesting, because previously the 14 years of austerity seemed to only affect elsewhere in the UK apart from Scotland. Mr Hoy.
Craig Hoy.
I thank the member for giving way. Will he draw a distinction, however, between public sector workers who are at the front line, and we all support significant wage rises where it's affordable there, as opposed to the army of spin doctors and other backroom staff that have ballooned under the SNP, particularly since the COVID pandemic?
Stuart McMillan.
So that seems to certainly very much run contrary to what Mr Hoy said in his opening comments earlier on in debate. But certainly, as my colleague Kevin Stewart indicated earlier on, and also after Ross Greer's contribution, the fact that the Scottish Parliament now has additional powers, we need to have additional civil servants to actually deal with that. Now, if Mr Hoy doesn't like that, that's entirely up to him. Now, Jackie Baillie also, as she's leaving the chamber, Jackie Baillie also listed some UK budget actions earlier on in her contribution. I'm going to list some other of the budget actions or inactions from the UK budget. So they failed to scrap the two-child benefit cap, which, according to Child Poverty Action Group, affects 1.6 million children, with families losing up to £3,455 per child. They scrapped the universality of the winter fuel payment, which Labour's own figures show could result in 4,000 excess deaths this winter. An estimate suggests that the cost to the NHS will be just shy of £1 billion, and £100 million of that in Scotland. WASPI women have once again been forgotten about, and as for the triple lock for pensioners, the Chancellor claimed that state pensioners would get a £470 uplift. But as money expert Martin Lewis has pointed out, this is, and I quote, "This is simply factually not true." Now, Labour also targeted students by rising tuition fees in England and Wales, despite previously ruling out such action. There's also been the broken promise of lower energy bills, as we know that energy costs are going up. And we also can't forget the fact that mortgages are now also going up, thanks to Labour's budget and Labour's actions. Now, the list goes on, but these are just some of the examples. Some of these examples are indicative of the same misery that the Tories inflicted upon us for 14 years. And also, it was announced this morning that the Labour-led Inverclyde Council have launched funding to mitigate the winter fuel payment decision taken by their bosses in Westminster. Now, this is all before we even get to Labour's decision to increase the national insurance contributions for employers. Now, Presiding Officer, while some might have agreed at the outset that it is reasonable to place this additional tax burden on employers, given the challenging financial situation that the UK does find itself in, but this has got a knock-on effect to employees and also customers, as we've already heard from colleagues. Now, Presiding Officer, Labour are raiding the payroll accounts of charities, care homes and also small businesses with this national insurance hike. And we also know about pharmacies, GP and dental practices, hospices, housing associations, and the list goes on. In my constituency, Argyllwyn Hospice and Clough Housing Association have raised with me directly the impact that this national insurance hike is going to have on their operations. Now, we are talking about thousands of pounds being handed back to the UK Government in national insurance payments, which we will just not see any return on. So, Presiding Officer, I don't see any change from Labour. I see the consistent approach that we had with the Tories in Westminster. I see an out-of-touch, red and blue Westminster establishment so far removed from reality that the only option for Scotland is for us to become an independent nation. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Carol Mochan to be followed by Claire Adamson. Up to 6 minutes. Ms Mochan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start the debate by saying the lack of insight from the Tory benches today is astounding. Let's be absolutely clear. 14 years of Tory chaos and decline has very much led us down this path to where we are today. But, Presiding Officer, our public services are seen... No, I'm going to make progress in the first minute, thanks. Our public services are seen as an essential part of society by anyone who considers themselves part of the labour and trade union movement. They are, put quite simply, part of our core belief system. Not only are they a testament to genuine, lasting politics, but they stand as a legacy of the serious transformational power a government can wield. And I am proud to say, in our country's history, this has, at every level of government, been at its best when Labour are in power. But whether it is my own party or other parties, I'm going to make progress of government, if there is a shared belief, a shared goal, then we should all work together to get the best outcomes for our communities. My plea to the Scottish Government today is use that ability to be transformational. You can improve Scotland's public service and give people a better future, of course.
Cabinet Secretary.
How does Carol Mochan expect us to take forward transformational change on a 1% real terms uplift if the majority of that is going to be spent paying down the Treasury costs of a national insurance uplift?
Carol Mochan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you for the intervention. And I suppose my point is, I'm saying, let's have a discussion about what is actually happening. So I hope, as I go through my speech today, that we will be able to have a think about that. In this debate today, I asked the Government, I asked the Cabinet Secretary to recognise the powers that they do have here in Scotland, to acknowledge the increase in funding that is coming to Scotland, and to actually debate the transformation we can have with a UK Labour government, which by the Scottish Government, the Cabinet Secretary and others' own admission is seeking to have a positive relationship with devolved administrations. That's an important point, a positive relationship with devolved administrations. Now, I accept that the public services and the third sector rightly have an interest in this issue today. How do we fund public services? And if the Government of the day alter this, it's important we provide people with clarity as to why these decisions were made. People do have a right to know, and this is why we should be clear and transparent in all of our parliaments, but of course in this Parliament. As the Labour motion indicates, long term it's about improving public services and getting this country on a firm footing. In order to even get close to achieving that, however, I'm going to make progress. We require a sustainable public sector that everyone can benefit from. An achievement that I must say this Scottish Government has often seemed to lack interest in based on the decisions over recent years. The SNP government, disappointingly after 17 years, the posture and the motion in the debate today is about the UK government and not actually an opportunity to discuss what we can do. Presiding Officer, Labour chose to protect working people in the recent UK budget, and that meant asking the wealthiest and business to pay their fair share. But this is not an overnight process. After more than a decade of devastating Tory austerity, but this is a solid step in the right direction. Scotland is set to receive an extra £3.4 billion in Treasury funding, our biggest settlement since devolution. And I'll say that again, it's the biggest block grant in the history of devolution. So, Presiding Officer, this SNP government have a responsibility to discuss delivery. What will they choose to do? Will they choose our frontline services? In closing, Presiding Officer, to remind the Chamber, within the increased block grant, Labour have taken into account the effect on the public sector of the additional national insurance contributions that they will be subject to, and that's responsible governance. The UK Government have made clear they will listen to the devolved governments going forward and take the liabilities they face into account. That is an open and ongoing discussion, and one that I hope they are engaging in constructively. And the Minister is laughing. I am seriously trying to ask, of course.
Minister.
I think it's completely delusional. I heard the word from another member there. The reality is that if the UK Government was serious about this, they would have done their homework, done the calculations, known what those numbers were, and had that conversation when they made this announcement. They haven't done that. They're backpedaling. They don't know what the numbers are. And this thing about negotiation, we know what the numbers are. We know what this impact is. If they're not going to pay that in full, that's not a negotiation. That's them undercutting public services in Scotland that the member claims to care so much about.
Carol Mochan, I can give you time back.
Thank you. If we could only have constructive conversations in this chamber, coming from the Minister that is in a government who have implemented an uncosted council tax freeze that has put public sector into enormous pressure. It's the same SNP that's drastically cut local government funds in its draft budget, which means it will have pressure on every part of our economy. It's the SNP that have 1 in 6 Scots on a waiting list and a burgeoning 2-tier healthcare system, and they do not allow us to discuss these things. So I do ask the Minister, I do ask the Cabinet Secretary to actually take time to discuss these things. Again, I'm going to say in closing, Presiding Officer, Labour have chosen to protect working people. And that means that they are asking those with the broadest shoulders to take as much as they can. This is the initial steps, and we do know that there's more discussion to be had. But I do hope that this Scottish Government will take action and discuss with the UK Government what can be done and where we do go to make sure that we can have an excellent public service here in Scotland. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Mochan. I now call Claire Adamson to be followed by Sanders Gulhani. Up
Can
to 4 minutes.
I check the timings, Presiding Officer?
There's been some question as a result of the reallocation of timings amongst the Labour group. Ms Mochan was entitled to 6 minutes, but open debate speakers are otherwise
Thank you
restricted
for
to 4
clarifying
minutes.
that, Presiding Officer. This afternoon we had a government statement on transitions for disabled people. As the person who was convener of the Education Skills in the last term of this Parliament, I know how important it was to Joanne Lamont to do something about transitions for disabled people, and I was delighted when Pam Duncan-Glancy continued that campaign in this session of the Parliament. What I asked the Minister about this afternoon was how vital third sector organisations and social enterprises would be to delivering the ambitions for transition and disabled people. And despite everyone coming behind that, one of the most heart-wrenching emails that I've had this week in relation to national insurance hikes was from Potential Living, a Scottish charity created by parents and carers in Motherwell in 1982 and providing care to people with additional support needs in the Motherwell, Wishaw and Bellshill areas. And they're just one of the many charities. They employ nearly 200 people in my area, delivering and who are worried about the devastating impact that this will have on their charity. I want to actually get to some fundamental truths in my contribution. We are having this debate, and my MSP colleagues on the opposite benches will already know these fundamental truths, and hopefully they are starting to accept a few truths long denied. The first is that I do not believe Labour MSPs and MPs support this hike in employers' national insurance contributions. They know, as well as I do, that such a hike will be passed on to lower-income workers through earnings drag, through redundancies, through pay rise squeezes, and an increase on the cost of living as other organisations pass this on through costs to consumers. It's a disproportionate hit that working people can ill afford during a cost of living crisis. Fixing the financial devastation left by the Tories should not be done on the backs of those who are most vulnerable and the least able to do it, whether that's cutting the winter fuel payment or this disproportionate impact on lower earners. The second truth is that the UK Government has made this move to avoid breaking a pre-election promise, but it's just semantics because it will be passed on to working people. The third truth is that the Labour MSPs received the same briefings as I did in advance of this debate. A litany of social enterprises, charities, social care providers, GPs and hospices. All of these briefings warn of the calamitous impact that this regressive tax hike will have on their already stretched finances. And the fourth truth, as they have shown, is that Labour MSPs have to defend this hike because London bosses have told them to. They know it's wrong. They know that charities, care providers, social enterprises doing crucial work in all of our communities are not an acceptable target. This fiscal measure is not in line with their values, but they have to defend it. And the last truth, long denied, a truth that I hope the public are starting to appreciate. It doesn't matter whether it's the Tories or Labour or any other political entity imposing fiscal and economic policy in Scotland. What matters is it is being imposed. No consultation, as the Minister has said, no input, no say. And the only way we can fix that is with Scottish independence.
Thank you. I now call Sanders Gulhani to be followed by Christine Graham. Up to 4 minutes. Dr Gulhani.
Thank you. I declare my interest as a practising NHS GP. Labour's speeches so far have been at best confused, trying to defend the indefensible. And while Labour's stated intention is to fund national initiatives, their decision to hike employers' national insurance contributions, a hike that Scottish Labour robustly supports, has far-reaching consequences. Their decision will harm Scotland's essential services, affecting our frail, elderly and vulnerable populations. As a doctor and MSP, I have seen first-hand the damage this policy will cause to health and social care services across our communities. Let's start with the impact on primary care services. This hike places a staggering financial burden on GP practices in Scotland. From conversations with colleagues, I know the average practice now faces an additional £20,000 to £30,000 per year in staff costs due to this increase. Let that sink in. 20 to 30,000. Unlike NHS trusts, GP practices are not exempt from this new tax on our local NHS. For GP practices, especially in rural areas where we already face a chronic shortage of GPs, this added cost is unsustainable. This hike will make it even harder for patients to secure an appointment, and that's on Anas Sarwar's watch.
Briefly, Cabinet
I very much appreciate Sanders Gilhany giving way. From the discussions that we have had, he will know that my intention is to put more resource into primary care for part of the reasons that he has set out. Does he recognise, as Alec Cole-Hamilton does, that this is making it much harder, especially if it is not fully funded by the UK Government?
Sanders Gilhany.
This makes some GP practices unsustainable, let alone harder. Let's now turn to dental services. Dentistry is another essential health service which will also be impacted by this tax on our local NHS. The British Dental Association has already highlighted the unsustainable funding model for NHS dentistry in Scotland. Labour's tax attack threatens to force even more dental practitioners out of business, exacerbating Scotland's dental health crisis. Without change, people across Scotland face a future where even a routine dental appointment will become a luxury they cannot access. Now, let's consider care homes. Care homes play a critical role in supporting our ageing population. Private care homes can receive half of what a local authority pays itself to look after people, but Labour's plan to shield local authority-managed care homes, but not the whole sector. When care homes are forced to cut back, it's our elderly population that suffers. Also hard hit is the third sector organisations. The voluntary sector is a significant employer that Carol Mochan talks about wanting to support. 5% of Scotland's workforce, and it delivers vital public services. Yet Labour's appetite to tax knows no bounds. The Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisation estimates Labour's tax hike will cost the voluntary sector about £75 million. Charities and non-profit organisations provide crucial support to Scotland's most vulnerable. In fact, Scottish Labour leader Anas Sarwar has previously praised charities here in parliamentary motions, recognising their importance. Charities such as Prostate Cancer UK, the Royal Strathclyde Bind Industries and Includem, who I met, and they told me they do not know how they will cope with this tax grab. Perhaps Anas Sarwar might echo his Labour colleague, Rhoda Grant, and advise our charities to suck it up and get their affairs in order. But perhaps he should submit a motion apologising for his party's cash grab on the third sector's vital resources. Presiding officer, Labour's hike in national insurance contribution is nothing short of a cash grab on the frail, on the elderly and on the vulnerable. This policy endangers primary care services, essential dental and health practices, care homes and third sector organisations that form the safety net of our communities. Scotland deserves better.
Thank you very much indeed. I call on Christine Graham to be followed by Ash Regan. Up to 4 minutes, Ms Graham.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Labour manifesto proposed, and I quote, "Deliver economic stability with tough spending rules so we can grow our economy and keep taxes, inflation and mortgages as low as possible," close quotes. Then the notorious promise that working people would see no difference in their pay packets because there'd be no increase in income tax or national insurance for those working people, which apparently did not include any employer, no matter if you ran a humble corner shop with a couple of employees. So what is the impact of increases of employers' national insurance? Over 7,000 charities in Scotland employ more than 133,000 people, 5% of Scotland's workforce. The SCVO has estimated, already referenced, it could cost the sector £75 million. They cannot pass increased costs to service users, so cuts to services must follow. My inbox is full of briefings from charities large and small confirming this. For example, the SSPCA, and I declare an interest as a member, is set to lose £400,000 a year due to this measure, which is almost double the cost of feeding all the animals in their care across Scotland for 1 year. For the health service, at a local level in my constituency, there are currently 35 GP practices, and this tax hike from the UK Government will impact on their services and is unavoidable. Heaven knows what the additional cost will be to the NHS borders across all its services, let alone the care sector. For local businesses, for example, Borders buses, I've been advised that their wage bill, their largest expense, will rise by at least 6%, restricting them investing in future recruitment and training, and may force them to cut back on marginal services, potentially impacting the local communities they serve. In the retail sector, more than 80 businesses, including supermarkets such as Asda and Tesco, have written to Rachel Reeves, and I quote, "For any retailer, large or small, it will not be possible to absorb such significant cost increases over such a short timescale. The effect will be to increase inflation, slow pay growth, cause shop closures and reduce jobs. This will impact high streets and customers right across the country." All of this was predictable. Higher prices for essentials, cutbacks and job losses. Indeed, the Independent Office of Budget Responsibility has projected that approximately 50,000 jobs could be lost due to the National Insurance contributions increase. So, if you have a pay packet, it might look the same, but it certainly won't buy so much. That is, if you have not lost your job as one of those cutbacks and still have a pay packet at all. How is that protecting working people, Ms Mauchline? And I return to that Labour manifesto promise to, quote, grow our economy, keep taxes, inflation and mortgages as low as possible. How's that going? Predicted 50,000 job losses. Is that growing the economy? Higher prices, mortgage increases. Is that keeping mortgages and inflation as low as possible? Depressed economy. People not being able to afford essentials, cuts in public services and to charities. No wonder Jackie Baillie sounded so rattled defending the indefensible. No wonder the Labour benches in here are practically empty. No wonder they had spare speaking slots. Shameful.
I now call Ash Regan. Up to 4 minutes, Ms Regan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Make work pay, Labour claim, while making employing people cost much more. Increasing the rate employers will pay and the threshold at which employers start paying is brutal for the public sector and for other organisations with modest profits and large workforces trying to balance their budgets and plan for growth. And the Scottish Government is correct that without this reimbursement of the £500 million cost of employer NICs to the public sector, that the impact on employees and users of public services in Scotland will add further pain to already stretched sectors. And due to Scotland's higher percentage of public sector workforce and more generous public sector pay deals, our public services will have disproportionate cost pressures than those of the rest of the UK. So Scotland is yet again being forced to pay for UK government mistakes, this time those of the Labour Party. Now, like UK Labour's cloth-eared approach to means-testing pensioners' winter fuel payments, it again demonstrates a lack of care or a lack of understanding of Scotland's different geography, demographics and economic make-up. Scottish Labour are in the untenable position now of pleading for Scottish votes on a platform of reversing its own government's budget positions. If Scottish Labour are now feeling ignored by their Westminster colleagues At least they know now what Scotland feels like, being consistently ignored and having our resources exploited at the whims of Westminster. And any funding that Labour is claiming that they'll give to Scotland, or give back to Scotland, I should say, is in fact giving back a portion of Scotland's own contribution from our people and from our resources. And that funding that's given to the public sector will now be absorbed by increased costs of employing their workforce if there is no adequate reimbursement. And Labour's drip feed, will they, won't they mitigate approach is neither serious, nor does it build any confidence at all across sectors who need consistency and confidence in order to do their workforce planning. The urgency of the situation is starkly evident from commentators' responses to Labour's UK budget, with the IFS and industry sectors sounding the alarm on the immediate and long-term consequences of this anti-growth budget. The Chancellor claims that she's presented a budget for growth, but I think this needs to be taken with the same large pinch of salt as Labour's manifesto pledge that they would not increase national insurance. The increased fiscal burden on Scotland's sizeable public sector will inevitably impact frontline services in healthcare, in social care and in education through increased staffing costs. What other options are there to balance budgets if not to reduce the services, delay projects, freeze recruitment or even cut staff to offset increased employment costs? Short-term thinking must end if we are to have an economy that works for all the people and the businesses here. And a change in this approach is not just necessary, it is in fact vital. So to conclude, Presiding Officer, do Scottish Labour honestly believe in a UK government solution for funding black holes in its own finances is to pass the buck to Scottish public services, our voluntary sector and our small businesses by dramatically increasing the cost of employing people? I don't think this is good enough. I support the government's motion. I don't think it goes far enough, and I think Labour should rethink this economic vandalism.
Thank you. We now move to closing speeches. A call first. Ross Greer, up to 4 minutes. Mr Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Day after day, headlines are emerging showing the real-life impact of this change. We saw at the start of this week Edinburgh University announce plans for redundancies. I would push back slightly on that particular institution, though. This is an institution with more than £1 billion in cash reserves, more than £2.7 billion in its overall reserves, and which has just given its principal a £20,000 pay rise. There are other universities in Scotland with next to nothing in their reserves, with no ability to withstand the significant additional cost, the £40 million cost of this across their sector. And our universities are major economic drivers in Scotland. They attract significant amounts of investment. To threaten our universities like this is monumentally counterproductive. And of course, the situation for our colleges is even worse. They don't have the ability to build reserves and withstand shocks that universities do, and that only some universities actually have. As Sandesh Gohani mentioned, the SCVO estimate the cost for the voluntary sector at £75 million. And I would ask the Labour Party, do they think that's worth it? I would respect at least the honesty of Labour MSPs standing up here and saying that they do genuinely and sincerely believe that it is worth that cost to increase public spending. I would disagree, but I would respect the honesty. We've heard anything but honesty from Labour today. I've been warned, and I'm sure others have, by some charities and social enterprises that are now reconsidering being real living wage employers. Now, I would profoundly disagree if they took that retrograde step, but I would understand entirely if the choice is between that and making staff redundant or cutting back on services that vulnerable people rely on. Museums and Galleries Scotland are ringing the alarm bell. They don't expect to be compensated, and the cultural sector is already under monumental pressure, and there's far more sectors facing catastrophe. But I do want to address the question of where else the money could come from, because, as I said in opening, I believe, the Greens believe, that increasing public sector spending was necessary. It would have been far more progressive to lift the 2% upper earnings limit that kicks in at £50,000 on national insurance. That would have raised £10 billion. There would have been £4 billion extra raised if this was extended to income from investments, such as the income made by landlords. £16 billion could have been raised if capital gains tax was equalised with income tax. Closing the loopholes in the offshore energy profits tax, the windfall tax on oil and gas, would have raised £6 billion. That would, of course, have the added bonus of not incentivising oil and gas companies to attempt to open new fields in the North Sea. A wealth tax starting at 1% on assets above £1 million would have raised £70 billion. That was in the Scottish Greens manifesto at the most recent election. So even a far more modest wealth tax, say starting at 0.5%, would have raised more than enough to cover the costs of this. Replicating Scotland's progressive income tax system UK-wide, that would have raised at least £12 billion. More public sector spending is essential. We need to undo the damage of 14 years of Conservative austerity on the NHS, on the social security system, on local government, on emergency services. Government shows its values when it's deciding who it's redistributing from and to. And I disagree with various aspects of UK government spending, most obviously on things like renewal of Trident nuclear weapons. But I agree on the principle of increasing spending. This was just absolutely the wrong way to raise that money. It's clearly not been thought through. If Labour was determined to do this, they should have been ready to answer questions on it, as Ivan McKee said, or they could have at least have given a year's notice to allow for those discussions to take place. And I have to say, it was incredible to see Jackie Bailey's response to my sedentary position to my challenge on Chas, Robin House and other hospices to say that that was a matter for Neil Gray, when Neil Gray hasn't been told by the UK government how much money he's even going to get to compensate for the costs of this decision. Carol Mochan talked about anything other than national insurance in her contribution. I agree with Christine Graham. The Labour MSPs in this debate today are clearly ashamed of the decision that their colleagues have taken down south. They should take that message back to them. They should urge them to reconsider. Our voluntary sector, our public sector and businesses across Scotland depend on them showing the courage to do that.
You need to conclude. Thank you. I call Mark Griffin up to 6 minutes. Mr Griffin.
Thank you, President Officer. This debate is fundamentally about the UK Chancellor's choices in our budget. The old saying is, to govern is to choose. No, but some things we have no choice over, like having to clean up the absolute financial catastrophe that was left behind by the Tory government before we came into office. But let's not just talk about one of those choices. Let's talk about all of those choices in the round, because the UK Chancellor's choices have given Scotland a budget that keeps the promises that Labour made during the elections, ends the era of austerity and provides billions of pounds of investment in public services. They mean an extra £1.5 billion for the Scottish Government this year, and another £3.4 billion next year. Scotland's capital budget, which had previously been projected to fall significantly, will now rise by 7.1% in real terms next year. The Chancellor's choices mean that 2025-2026 is the biggest financial settlement in the history of devolution. And I'll take the Cabinet
Secretary.
I'm very grateful to Mark Griffin for giving way. He is right that to govern is to choose. But what choice is the Scottish Government left with if on our 1% real terms uplift to our resource block grant, which we can share the data on for Mark Griffin to be able to cast his eye over, he is asking, his party is asking the Scottish Government to pay the UK Treasury's national insurance contributions uplift from. What choice do we have then to invest in transforming public services?
Mark Griffin.
The resource budget this year is £1.5 billion more than it was when the UK budget was set in the spring. It's £3.4 billion more next year. £5 billion more for this Scottish Government to spend, as well as the commitment from the UK Government to mitigate the impact of this change on our public services. Now, across the UK, the Chancellor has chosen to increase spending by £70 billion per year over the next 5 years. Now, the Scottish Government's Finance Secretary herself said that the budget was a step in the right direction and it met a core ask of the Scottish Government. But it's for the Finance Secretary and this Government now to choose what the next step for Scotland is. Will we see a radical new direction for public finance that has been taken in the rest of the UK, or will it be more of the same, managing decline and living with the consequence of successive bad financial choices? This is a budget that chooses to protect working people. It chooses to make sure that the wealthiest citizens and businesses pay their fair share for increasing funding for public services. The Chancellor's budget can help us to fix our NHS, kick-start our economy and deliver investment for Scotland if we choose to do so. And despite what many others in this debate would have you believe, the Treasury has clearly confirmed, that it will compensate public sector employers for the higher costs resulting from the national insurance contributions increase. I think it's absolutely scandalous that the commitment from the Treasury has been misrepresented in the way that it has in this debate. And the key in Scotland, and this was a point that was made by Ash Regan, the key in Scotland is that because there will likely be a disproportionate impact on the Scottish budget from increases in employer national insurance, given that Scotland has a larger proportion of public sector employment. Now, of course, there is a conversation to be had with the Treasury about the liabilities that the Scottish public sector may have, and the UK Government have stated clearly that they are more than happy to take an active part in those discussions. So I would suggest it is more important for the Scottish Government, rather than grandstanding in this chamber, to take up the opportunities to negotiate and properly discuss the detail that they clearly would like to discuss with the UK Government to fulfil the commitment that they have made to mitigate the impact on the public service in Scotland. The new Labour budget, it's good news for working people, it's good news for public services in Scotland, but only if the Scottish Government choose to spend that money wisely. Now, I can understand why some of the colleagues on the SNP benches might be confused about some of the choices that Rachel Reeves has made. But,
resume your seat, please, Mr Griffin. Mr Stewart, I will not tolerate barracking of that nature. It is up to the member on their feet whether or not they take an intervention. Mr Griffin has made it clear he is not taking that intervention, so that does not invite you to heckle. Mr Mark Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. But let's be honest here. The Scottish Government wouldn't know a good budget decision if it looked it in the face, because it's been such a long time since they've made one. Scotland is suffering from 17 years of SNP budgets, which have taken us in absolutely in the wrong direction. We're dealing with the consequences of a careless disregard that this government have shown with our hard-earned cash. The choices the SNP government have... Can
you resume your seat a second? Point of order, Christine Graham.
Presiding officer, certainly not challenged in any way whatsoever. I don't know if Mr Griffin actually said he was taking no interventions. I just want to know so I don't waste my time.
That is not a point of order. What I suggested was that Mr Griffin had made clear he wasn't taking that intervention, and therefore it was not appropriate to shout in the way that Mr Stewart had indicated. But it's up to Mr Griffin, in the very limited time he has available left, whether or not he takes any interventions. Mark Griffin.
Yeah, Presiding Officer, I've taken intervention from the front bench. There are clearly facts that need to be set straight, and in the closing time that I have available, I will attempt to do so without any further interventions which seem to muddy a very clear picture that the UK Government have set out in terms of the compensation to the public services in Scotland to mitigate with the change to national insurance. Presiding Officer, this is a record financial deal for Scotland. It could have a real positive impact on public services in Scotland, but the SNP must get used to using money better. The billions in extra cash delivered can't simply be used to cover up the cracks of many of this government's buy now, pay later policies. Labour has delivered real change in the UK with a budget that asks those with the broadest shoulders to pay their fair share towards our NHS, our schools and communities. Labour has opened the door to a better, fairer way of funding those services, but now in Scotland it is for the SNP government to make sure that the choices Rachel Reeves has made also deliver real change for Scotland, as opposed, Presiding Officer, to complaining about how the money they asked for has raised and then spending it badly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Griffin. I now call on Murdo Fraser up to 7 minutes. Mr Fraser.
Well, thank you, Presiding Officer. This has been a debate that has seen all parties in this chamber, with one exception, united in condemnation of a Labour budget. And we've seen the three stalwarts of the Labour Party sitting on the front bench there, rather lonely, rather embarrassed throughout this whole debate, and so they should be, presiding officer. Craig Hoy reminded us earlier of the broken promise by Rachel Reeves made in advance of the general elections when she said, and I quote, "We will not increase national insurance." Of course, did quite the opposite. And it's up there with the other pledges made by Labour, the pledges not to remove the winter fuel allowance, the pledge not to remove agricultural relief on inheritance tax, the promise to cut energy bills for every household by £300. None of these delivered, all of them broken promises. And Craig Hoy was quite right to quote the Institute for Fiscal Studies Director Paul Johnson, who said this is a straightforward breach of a manifesto commitment. And if Jackie Baillie wants to intervene on me instead of shouting from a sedentary position, I will happily give way to her.
Jackie Baillie.
Oh, here we go. I think the same lack of self-awareness that's being displayed by Murdo Fraser is interesting after 14 years of a calamitous Tory government, the mess we've had to clear up, and we're now focused on improving the lot of working people, both in Scotland and across the UK.
Murdo Fraser.
Let me just remind Jackie Baillie that the deficit inherited by the Conservatives from the Labour government in 2010, when we came to power, was in fact double, more than double, the deficit we left to the Labour Party in July this year. And if anyone is crashing the economy, it's Jackie Baillie's colleagues in Westminster, presiding officer. Let's just look at the outcome of the budget. £40 billion in tax rises, the highest on record, the highest tax burden in the history of this country. And what are all the consequences of that budget? According to the Office for Budget Responsibility, lower growth. Today, inflation up to 2.3%, shot up just in the course of the last month. Prediction that interest rates, instead of steadily reducing, which was the trajectory when the Conservatives left office, interest rates forecast to go up and wages will be lower. Yes, I'll give way to Christine Graham.
Just to add on the OBR's prediction, does he accept, as I do, that there could be 50,000 jobs lost across the UK economy due simply to national insurance employers' contributions rising, something the Labour Party would not let me intervene on?
Murdo Fraser.
Yes, I'm happy to agree with that excellent point made by my friend Christine Graham on the SNP benches. And what happened, presiding officer, to all the pledges we had from the Labour Party in advance of the election and in advance of the budget, that the approach they were going to develop was to go for growth. They said the way to get more money for the public services was to grow the economy. What they've done is deliver a budget that will do the opposite, a budget that will shrink the economy and not grow it, presiding officer. So we've been debating this afternoon the impact on Scotland, and the Health Secretary quite rightly highlighted in his opening contribution the impact on the public sector of some £500 million. Now, of course, he's right. He's right to highlight that. But that is only part of the picture. And I suppose the criticism we would have of the SNP motion is it only illustrates a small part of the overall impact on Scotland of these national insurance changes. Because public services are not only delivered directly by the public sector, as we know. And there are other parts of the public sector, and we've heard this throughout the afternoon, where public services are delivered. For example, GP practices, by dentists, by community pharmacies. Sandesh Gohani highlighted the impact on these sectors. He said this was a new tax on our local NHS, and was quite right to do so. We see this impacting on hospices. We see it impacting on museums and galleries. We see it impacting on universities and colleges. On universities alone, a £45 million hit on universities. And Ross Greer quite rightly identified that Edinburgh University is looking at having to make redundancies to try and face this bill, and many other universities will have to do the same. When it comes to the care sector, 49 members of the Coalition of Care and Support Providers in Scotland said the cumulative cost to their members would be £21 million, and the overall cost of the sector, of course, much higher than that. And of course, there will be a broader impact on the third sector, again not mentioned in the government motion. Sandesh Gohani again quoted the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations. Their estimate is a £75 million hit on that sector, not taking account of inflation. And Christine Graham highlighted the SSPCA, animal welfare charity we all know very well, who've said it will be a £400,000 hit annually on their activities, double the cost of funding all the animals in their care for an entire year. That's just one charity, and that will be reflected right across the sector. But we also have to look at the private sector impacts too. The British Retail Consortium wrote this week to the Chancellor, highlighting on behalf of their members a hit of £2.33 billion across retail across the UK, and that's in addition to £4.73 billion in other costs. Altogether, a hit of over £7 billion on the retail sector across the United Kingdom as a result of the Chancellor's choices. When it comes to hospitality, the Scottish Hospitality Group have said there will be an average cost of £160,000 per business. And Stephen Leckie at the Crieff Hydro was in the media just the other week saying the additional cost to his business alone will be between £450,000 to £500,000 a year from national insurance, which would have a serious impact on his profitability as a business. So, Presiding Officer, just to conclude, the Scottish Government are talking about mitigating for the public sector. I have sympathy for that approach, but it doesn't go far enough because it doesn't cover the cost of mitigating for the third sector, for parts of the public services delivered by third sector contractors, and also the private sector. And our approach would be to say the government instead, the UK government instead, should abandon the increase altogether. Because what it does is it damages growth, it damages the economy, and it will cost jobs. The Scottish Government can use its budget to try and relieve this tax burden. Liz Smith, I commend my colleague Liz Smith. She said she'd found an SNP economic strategy. I'm not sure I've found one yet, but I'm glad that Liz Smith was able to find one. But there's an opportunity in the SNP budget coming just in a few weeks' time to look at business rates, to look at income tax, to use some of the Barnett consequentials that have come from the UK budget to try and alleviate some of that pressure. I would encourage them to do that. That's the point covered in the amendment by my colleague Craig Hoy this afternoon, Presiding Officer, which I'm very pleased to support.
Thank you. I now call Ivan McKee to wind up the debate. Up to 9 minutes, Minister.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. It's been an interesting debate. I think it's provided some clarity on people's positions or lack of positions on this very important matter, which has profoundly broader implications. My colleague, the Cabinet Secretary for Health, laid out the impact of the UK Government's national insurance rise on public services, and we've identified already more than £500 million that has on those direct services. He also talked about the impact on some of the other services that have been mentioned this afternoon on NHS contractors. We estimate another £40 million. But there's much, much more on top of that, Presiding Officer, be it in adult social care, children's social care, early learning childcare, or indeed universities, colleges, a number that would run into perhaps another £200 million in total. Significant impact highlighted. Indeed, I'll give way.
Anders Kulhani.
Thank you. To govern is to choose, according to Mark Griffin. So this choice by Labour to tax our local NHS is disastrous. Does the Minister agree with Alistair Hoare, CEO of Scottish Huntingtons, that these hikes will hurt the most vulnerable as his charity struggles to cope?
Minister.
Yes, of course they will, and this is something this government has made that point repeatedly since these very misguided tax increases were implemented by the UK Labour government. Kevin Stewart highlighted the sectors that will be impacted, which are GPs, social care, dentists, optometrists, universities, colleges, charities, third sector, hospices. The list goes on and on. And as other members have mentioned, that it's important to raise also the impact of these national insurance contribution increases on the wider economy that we all rely on to provide the wealth to pay in the long run for our public services. This morning I had the pleasure of having a round table with a dozen sectors, key sectors from our economy, where we talked about many issues, but it's absolutely true to say that this, for most sectors, was the single most important issue that they wanted to raise with me and encourage the Scottish Government to continue to press the UK Labour Government on the misguided nature of this measure. The retail sector alone in Scotland, according to the Scottish Retail Consortium, has calculated an impact on their sector of £190 million. It will be passed on to job losses in the sector or to increases for consumers at this difficult time. The cost of living crisis is the last thing that we need. And the comments by the Chair of the OBR, the impact that this tax rise will have on the wider economy has already been made. To be clear, this Scottish Government is focused on delivering growth. We recognise the purpose of this discussion today to talk about the impact on the public sector, but we very much also recognise the impact that it's had on the wider economy and the private sector. Claire Adamson made that a very effective contribution, I felt, and pointed out, for those that had missed this point, of the lack of support for this measure among Labour members of this chamber. Not dissimilar to the winter fuel payment cuts, where we've seen Labour members running for cover. So much so, in fact, that Labour had to reduce the number of speakers they put forward in the debate today because they struggled to find members to fill those slots. We had three contributions. We had the diversionary Jackie Baillie, whose claims of billions of pounds of extra resource coming to the Scottish Government have been thoroughly debunked by the analysis that's been done already, and has been highlighted in the debate already. The increase in real terms is less than 1%. Yes, I will give way to Jackie Baillie.
I'm very grateful to the Minister. Can I ask him two simple questions? Have you or have you not been in dialogue with the UK Labour Government about additional resources to deal with the national insurance contributions? And if that's the case, once you get the additional money, isn't it the case that the decision is a matter for the Scottish Government?
Always to the Chair, Minister.
Well, just when I made the point about the diversionary Jackie Baillie, she stands up to throw more of a smokescreen round about this issue. Of course we've been engaged with the UK Government. It's ridiculous to suggest otherwise. There are letters from my colleague, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Cabinet Secretary for Health and others to the UK Government pleading for clarity on what they're going to take forward. We wait, nothing coming back from the UK Government as to what that will... If Jackie Baillie can intervene and tell me what that number is, I'd be delighted to hear it.
What's the number?
Well, exactly, because Jackie Baillie doesn't know the number, because there is no number, because the Treasury hasn't provided a number. And for all the talk about the delusional Carol Mochan talking about talks about working together...
Minister, if you could resume your seat.
Yes, I can.
I would suggest that you're steering a bit close to nicknames, a bit of courtesy and respect. I think you can still get that point across in other ways. Minister, please resume.
Thank you, President Officer. You have removed my opportunity to provide some alliteration in this debate, but I'll do my best to steer round your very clear guidance. Carol Mochan talks about working together. We have made that effort to reach out to the UK Government, but again, nothing coming back, no numbers, no clarity on what money we've got to make those choices that she talks about. And I think it's the UK Labour Government that's finding out that to govern is to choose, and they made some very poor choices in the first few months, the consequences of which have been felt right across the public sector, Scottish public sector and Scottish economy. Yes, I will give way.
Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, President Officer. And while the Minister is talking about numbers, there are some numbers that have been left out today. Numbers such as 7,000 charities in Scotland being at risk from this rise, with Marie Curie being taxed for an additional £3 million, which can only be made up by cutting services to people with cancer. Does the Minister think that this is acceptable? Does he think that the Labour Party should rest in their laurels and allow this to happen?
Minister.
No, of course it's absolutely not acceptable, and even as we approach decision time, we see the gaps on the Labour benches, that their members don't want to sit here and listen to the harsh reality of what their government is doing to Scotland's public services and Scotland's economy. And Mark Griffin, I think, in denial, talking about setting the record straight. Well, set the record straight. Talks about choices. The Treasury hasn't confirmed anything. That's the reality of where we are, and we wait for a number that will absolutely have to be well in excess of that £500 million, including all the other costs. We're talking about another 100 or 200 million, perhaps on top of that, and we'll see what they come forward with. But it'll be very clear to point out the difference between what we need and what they're willing to offer when we do eventually get a number, and we really have to hope that that is in advance. We get that number in advance of when we have to deliver the Scottish budget in a few weeks. President Officer, we understand the Chancellor had to make some difficult decisions to address the gaping fiscal hole left by the Conservatives. We already knew the lasting impact of the twin disasters of Brexit and the failed mini-budget of the Johnson and Truss years has had on the UK and Scottish economies, decisions that Scotland opposed at every turn, and yet, once again, we have to live with the consequences. But the Labour Party didn't listen to our warnings of the scale of the challenge that was coming. Its manifesto ruled out more progressive tax options to address this challenge, and as we went through that election campaign in July, making those points that Labour denied at every turn and then accepted the black hole that existed once they were in office. Presiding Officer, increasing employers' national insurance was and is the wrong choice fundamentally, and we've heard today, despite it being a reserve tax, has an enormous impact on public service delivery in Scotland. We still don't know how much funding we will receive to mitigate this damage. We do not know the mechanism by which it will be applied, and we do not know the timing of when it will be confirmed. The latest indication from the UK Treasury is that they will apply the Barnett formula in the usual way. Presiding Officer, if that is the case, our funding may be as low as £380 million, perhaps even lower, based on estimates from the OBR on the total cost to the public sector, very, very far away from the reality of what we need to cover direct employment costs, the devolved, and of course the local government in Scotland, who have highlighted a £265 million just for local government in Scotland, let alone the additional costs for all the other contracted services so critical to our NHS and wider public services that I've covered this afternoon. Crucially, we do not know when any Barnett or any other funding will actually arrive. We may have to wait until the UK Spring Statement for confirmation of the amounts, which is simply unacceptable when we are so close to the Scottish budget. We will, of course, ensure that our budget accounts for the increased costs the Chancellor is imposing on us, but we will wait to hear whether the Chancellor will provide the funding or whether, unfortunately, it will have to be taken from elsewhere to enable us, as we must do by law, to balance our budget every year. If the Scottish Government does not receive that funding to meet these costs, it will be another sign, yet another sign the Labour Party is implementing austerity by the back door. Whether it's winter fuel payments, the continuation of the bedroom tax, increased national insurance burden that falls yet again on this Government and this Parliament to try and mitigate the damage of UK Government decisions. But, President Officer, our fiscal powers only stretch so far, and it's for these reasons that we call on the Chancellor to act now and ensure public service delivery in Scotland is protected. Thank you, President Officer.
Thank you, Minister, and congratulations on weaving in your alliteration for all that. That concludes the debate on impact on national insurance increases on public services. There will be a brief pause before we move to the next item of business to allow front benches to change.